All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining me this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for tonight, Emily Schmidt. She is an Emmy Award-winning journalist and communications consultant who has told stories while floating in the air, wading through floodwaters, and while covering the President of the United States. Emily's based in DC, so you will get a chance to meet her in person. Her and I will be jointly facilitating, although she'll be taking the lead on it, the crisis communications simulation that we're going to do while we are in town. She's worked as a freelance correspondent for CNN News Source, covering stories around the world. Um, and this is her fourth year working with the program, so she's gotten to know McCombs and our students very well. More broadly, she's led media training, public speaking, and crisis management for all sorts of organizations, not only in the US, but across 5 continents. So she has a lot of global experience. And she's also worked for the Department of State's Office of Anti-Terrorism Assistance, coached speakers for the main stage at TED Talk, sorry. And she has also experience in the classroom working as an adjunct professor of journalism at Syracuse, and I believe also at her alma mater, the University of Missouri at Columbia. She is, like me, originally a Midwesterner, although I'm from Illinois. She's from Missouri. I won't hold it against her. And like me, she's also an avid hiker and has gone to, with her kids, all 50 states and all 7 continents. So with that, I will turn things over to Emily.
Dr. Warner, it's always great to be with your class, and to all of you, thanks for being here tonight. Your reputation precedes you. It's really fantastic. One of my favorite things to do every year is working with your cohorts, because you bring such a wide variety and depth and wealth of experiences, and a lot of creativity to what you're doing. And what we're going to do together when we are in Washington is a lot of hard work. It's also a lot of fun, and it's your mind thinking very quickly about how to deal with crises. When we're done, none of us are going to probably be able to be the experts if a plane were to crash, or a company CEO were to have to step down because of a sexual scandal, or something that you've never even thought of were to happen. We're not going to make you experts in this, but what we do want to do, even if you think that you will never, ever have to do this in your career, is make you aware of how difficult it can be to be as perfect as possible with at an imperfect science. Crisis communications, when we talk about standing out in the storm, has a couple of different meanings. One, you want to make sure that you still keep your organization's identity. You want to come out of it whole, that people can tell, that's you in the blue umbrella. But you also know that when you're standing out in the storm, you might need some protection that you haven't had before. And so we're going to talk about kind of an overview of ways to do that. I will really love your interjections. If I don't see you for some reason, just unmute yourself and interrupt me. As my career in journalism, I spend a lot of time with people talking to me in my ear and telling me to wrap or to move on, or some new information. And so I'm accustomed to it and welcome this. And tonight, what we're going to do is just give you a little bit of an overview, and then we will start to put it all together when we are together for the simulation that we'll do in a couple of weeks. One thing to know when we do that is some of these ideas that we're talking about tonight really will come in handy. We won't go back and say, remember that model or remember what to think about. But as we're going through this, be thinking about, oh, if I were to be assigned a stakeholder group in a crisis, which you will definitely have happening, how might I apply some of these things? So as you're thinking about this, just be putting in your mind, how would you play that out in your industry or in a simulation that might come down the pike. I kind of think of crisis communications as a little bit like this. Can you hear kind of a video game sound going on? The idea of ducks crossing the highway. And in many ways, when it's a crisis, what's happening is what's happening to you right now. You're trying to focus on what's happening with those ducks and with these vehicles coming by, you're probably not exactly listening to me. You're not exactly knowing where things are going to go, but you just know there's a lot coming at you, and you don't have a lot of data points to know what is going on. This is a little bit about what happens in a crisis. It's hard to know what's coming at you. It's hard to know the direction in which you're going. And you don't have a perfect answer. You don't have a perfect path. Just last week, in fact, about 8 days ago, at about this time of night, I got a phone call from a client that I had worked with a couple of years earlier. And look, you can breathe now. Those ducks made it across. Look, there's a reason that I talked over all of that, because that's kind of what a crisis is. There is just so much happening, and you just aren't necessarily prepared. You can say expect the unexpected, but that is so much easier said than done. And as I was striving to say, was that 8 nights ago at about this time of night, I got a call from someone who had been a client of mine about 3 years ago on a completely different kind of project. And she's now working with a communications project for a global company that called her up and said, "We've got a problem. We had a social media post that someone did about our company like years ago, and it wasn't even necessarily a bad post, but it was something that was at best middling, at best neutral, but it was starting for some kind of unknown reason because it had to do with health and science and what's going on in the geopolitical space right now. Someone had found it, posted it, and it was taking on this whole other life of its own, which in and of itself wasn't necessarily bad. It didn't necessarily make the company look bad, but the company was concerned because at the exact same time, they were just about to roll out some new investment news, and they were working with investors, and they were really concerned that this old social media post that was getting this new life was going to derail what was really going on that was much more important with their investors. And so this person called me because their CEO in a country somewhere across the ocean had called up and said, "Hey, tomorrow, could you get someone to give us half an hour of media relations and crisis communications training to get through this?" I didn't have half an hour in that next day that I could do it. So I referred her to someone else who does crisis communications, who incidentally was at that very moment in a rolling out some talking points for a national story that I guarantee you have seen in the headlines. And that person was getting a call saying, "Can you help this person?" Which they did. And they got in the next day and helped this company that was an international company. But I say all this to say that company wasn't even in deep, dire straits. But what they were realizing and trying to get going very quickly was they were not prepared. They were not prepared to handle what was unexpected. And they thought that they could get it taken care of in half an hour. Here's what the person who called me and what I knew and what I knew and what the person I called knew. You can't do this in half an hour. You can't train someone to say, "We'll just respond and we'll do it smoothly and we'll have thought out who our stakeholders are and what our messages are and what the ramifications are." We knew that they were going to need more than that. And so this is kind of what we're going to spend tonight doing, and spend the 4 hours together that we have and when you come to Washington, is starting to think about how do you prepare yourself to think differently when you have to do it when you are in this? Because crises are happening all the time. In fact, it was just 3 years ago that the Collins Dictionary, this time of year when people do the word of the year, they said their word of the year was permacrisis, an extended period of instability and insecurity, especially one resulting from a series of catastrophic events. And though I don't know all of you clearly yet and don't know all of your industries, I'm guessing by knowing your cohorts from years past that a lot of you get this idea of what a permacrisis feels like. This idea that we're going from one thing to a next, and you're watching the news or reading the headlines in the morning or in your company saying, when does this end? And so I'd just love to know from all of you, anyone who would be willing to just unmute and yell out, what kind of crises are you seeing happening in your world or in the world right now? When you think about a crisis that's going on right now, what are you noting? Anybody have anything that comes to mind?
Tariffs,
Tariffs. Yeah, I just saw a
automotive
story on
recalls.
soybeans in the United States. And Dr. Warner was wrong. I went to school in Missouri, but I grew up in Iowa and I grew up on a soybean farm. And I grew up, and the people who I know and my family are worried about tariffs and what that means for them because China's not buying that. And that's only one small slice of the industry. They are in crises and trying to figure out what's going on. Tariffs a great one. Anybody else see a crisis happening?
Not currently, but I had to deal with a situation of embezzlement, and I have to figure out a way to work with auditors and stuff. And I work for a financial institution, an investment bank, and if the word gets out, it's crisis. Clients get panicked, so we have to work our way to figure out how to recover stuff, but also keep it calm, not make it public. But eventually, it happened to be public. But yeah.
I appreciate that, right? The idea of, I love when you said if the word gets out, because it doesn't mean there's not a crisis. There's one that you're dealing with internally, and then you're thinking what happens externally, and that idea of stakeholders. That's going to be a key thing that we're going to talk about together. So we've got something as broad and geopolitical as tariffs. We've got something that can be as narrow, but with real ramifications for embezzlement. Anyone else have a crisis going on that they're seeing
Shutdown,
in the world?
shutdown and payment of government employees
Yeah.
and operation of the FAA. So travel attached to that.
Anyone on a flight in the next 48 hours wondering if you're going to get there, if there's an air traffic controller to get your plane off the ground and safely back to the ground? I don't know how many of you, if any of you, are government employees, but as you said, I'm in Washington, D.C., and the number of people who I know who are furloughed and wondering, are they going to get back pay, as the law says? Are they going to get that? The number of people who are contractors who are having jobs suddenly put on hold is huge. I had a project with a federal government contractor that wrapped up a week before, and they talked with me this week and said we're not scheduling anything for coming up because we don't know when the government's going to allow that, right? That's a crisis for a lot of people, not just who's going to pay the bills, but when do you go back to work? Or those who I have friends who are essential workers, so their crisis is that they're going to work when no one else is. Another crisis. So you start to see how much of this is going on in our lives. And I think this is one of the numbers that most strikes me when I think about crisis communications, and it's the number 95. It goes back to a study that PwC did, and it was back in 2019. And normally I wouldn't go back to talk about something that's 6-year-old numbers, but this was important because for the first time ever in 2019, they did a survey where they were talking about crisis solutions. And they basically said, how many of you, major companies, around the world, how many of you think that there could be a major crisis in your company in the next 2 years? Not a huge surprise that 95% of them said, yes, we expect there to be a crisis. But you know what was interesting in 2019 when 95% of organizations that were surveyed by PwC said we think there's a crisis in the next 2 years? Not one, not a single one of those companies said that they foresaw that a pandemic could cause a crisis. And I think that's so striking to say, think of all the cross sections of industries that they were doing and everyone who thought they were doing a good job of anticipating something's going to happen. Not one of them thought it was going to be a pandemic. And I think even though it was 6 years ago, we can all agree we know how much that had an impact on the world. They were 95% of people in the survey thought it would need some capability. They also believed that that crisis was imminent in the next 2 years. So that's an interesting thing to me. But then you look at what happened in 2023. And so PwC did another survey, and this is now the last survey of its kind, the latest one that PwC did when I'm giving you the 2023 numbers. And they said, what kind of crisis do you see? And 91% of the companies then said they've still had at least one disruption that was other than the pandemic. They're talking about the fact that the pandemic was huge, but they're also having these major things that are happening. So whether it's tariffs, whether it's embezzlement, whether it's a government shutdown, they're getting hammered. 9 out of 10, more than 9 out of 10 companies have had this happen since the pandemic. This is real, and this is what's going on. And then I think this number is critical, and that is the number of 100%. 100% is not a number that you see very often, but we experienced it with your cohorts a couple of years ago when our simulation was having to do with these little people, babies. And our question was in our simulation, does every child deserve to eat? Does every child deserve to eat? And when we asked that question, every single one of your predecessors said, yes, we agree. Every child deserves to eat. So you would think, where's the crisis here? We are all coming from the same value proposition. We all agree with where we're going on this. Everyone deserves to eat. But as we moved forward in our simulation, when we gathered in the place at the Washington Center where you will be in a couple of weeks, we saw that suddenly when we put a crisis situation, and at that point it was a baby formula company, it was a created simulation, but it was loosely based on tainted baby formula and children who were getting sick from it. Everyone who had said, yes, we believe that babies deserve to eat, started fighting because they were representing different stakeholders. They were the parents, they were the pediatricians, they were the executive office, they were the legislative office, they were the trade associations, they were the CVS and Walmarts of the world. And suddenly, when they were representing, even in a simulation, even in something that had no real world results, when they started getting into their role and their belief system for those 4 hours, suddenly they were fighting. And it didn't matter that we all agreed that everyone deserved to eat. Everyone was approaching this crisis from a much different perspective, much more self-serving or at least sector serving. And I think it's one of the biggest reminders that crisis communications is hard because we are dealing with everyone saying, what is in it for me? And it is really a difficult thing and an inexact science to be able to figure it out. There's no Excel spreadsheet that's going to get you the exact answer of what you have to do. Crisis communications is basically thinking, how are you collecting information? How are you processing? And how are you sharing the information? With whom are you sharing it before, during, and after a crisis? And that is an arc that's really important. Last year, I had a group, an association that worked with attorneys that came to me and said, will you do a series of webinars? And we spent 4 weeks dicing what is a crisis, and then how do you need to do it before and during and after. And what we found were so many organizations maybe did the before, certainly did the what happened to me last week when someone called and said, can you help us get through this in half an hour, sort of during a crisis, but then taking that after action report and saying, what did we learn? What are we going to do differently? You all mentioned some of the things that are going on for crises right now. Just this morning, I was taking a look at some of the crises that I'm seeing in the world in terms of this is what shows up in Google search. We have Target in a brand identity crisis. Target doesn't carry the cachet that it used to. And so what does that mean if you're a Target stakeholder or stockholder? China, you mentioned tariffs. China's snub of U.S. soybeans is a crisis for American farmers. In Macron, they had a government dropping in 14 hours and one of the shortest terms ever. So you've got an entire country facing this. The crisis at Tylenol. We've all studied what happened when they had the Tylenol problem decades ago and how they were shown to be really leaders and a great example, shining example of how to do crisis communications. But we see what's happening politically, where suddenly they're brought back into the headlines when it comes to pregnancy and autism and different takes on that. So Tylenol's dealing with something that they may not have anticipated. Nestle plunging into crisis when it was a sex scandal, or then something that can be much more local. Sutter health workers. We may not know Sutter Health if in our part of the country, but here they're having to do a strike. So what does that mean if you're the hospital? What does that mean if you're a patient? What does that mean if you're an employee? Just giving us an example that these crises are happening all the time. Sometimes it helps to see what doesn't work. And I want to show you what's really considered to be one of the worst visible examples of crisis communications. It happened, more than 10 years ago in West Virginia, and there had been a chemical spill in Charleston, West Virginia. It had contaminated the drinking water for hundreds of thousands of people. And so the president of the company that was in charge of the chemical spill came before the press about a day afterwards. And a local reporter, this was someone who wasn't, was pretty new at their job, wasn't particularly well paid. I think it was a weekend, it was night, but they asked some questions that drew a lot of criticism in terms of the answers. So I want you to just listen in. This is what we don't want you doing when you do our simulation in a couple of weeks. Sorry, let me skip this video. This is YouTube doing this to us. Here we go.
Well, guys, it's been an extremely long day. I'm having a hard trouble talking at the moment. I would appreciate it if we could wrap this thing up. I will.
We have a lot. We actually have a lot of questions, and it's been a long day for a lot of people who don't have water. So, can you give us an exact timeline as to how this all happened? The DEP was saying earlier today, as early as 8:15 yesterday morning, they were getting reports, and that you all did not call it in until 12 noon. The DEP was already here at 11:15. So, what's the timeline on all this?
We were aware of the leaking storage tank around 10:30. We load tank trucks of this material on a regular basis, and occasionally we've had reports of an odor previously. So we were first aware of any material being spilled at 10:30 yesterday.
Could it have been earlier than yesterday? Because we've also received reports into our newsroom that it was as early as Wednesday, possibly Tuesday. People were starting to smell this in the area.
We have no information on that.
Are there no systems in place to alert you of a leak at your facility other than a smell?
At this moment in time, I think that's all we have to do. So thanks for coming.
What? We have more questions. No, we're not done.
Sure, no.
We're not done. No. Anyone else have any other questions?
I don't usually like to point out something and say this wasn't good, but I think it's pretty universal. That wasn't good. And if you think about what was happening, he's talking to people, basically saying, "Don't worry about your water," while he's sitting there drinking bottled water. It didn't land well, and the story did not land well for the Freedom Industries. They actually declared bankruptcy 8 days after the spill happened. They eventually were fined the company $900,000. So the judge at the time said this is mostly symbolic because you've lost all value in the company. But Gary Southern, who was the former president of Freedom Industries, actually ended up being sentenced in federal court to 1 month in prison, 6 months supervised release, $20,000 fine. He had pled guilty to 3 charges, including negligent discharge of pollutant, charge causing a discharge of refuse, and violating a condition of a Clean Water Act permit. You look at that, and it's really easy from our position to say, I would never have done that, right? There's so much more that he could have done. He could have expressed empathy to the people that was going on. He could have been shown at least a facade of respect to the people who were asking the questions, because his disdain for the reporters translated to a disdain for the audience. And he needed to remember his audience were all the people who didn't have drinking water, who were wondering what was safe. By losing empathy, by focusing on himself, it was late, he was tired, as opposed to, we know there's a concern, we're doing everything we can to find out. We don't have all the answers yet, but we're working to get it. Would have been a whole lot easier. So we sit here and we say, well, of course, we would have done that so much better. But I also want to give you an example. Let me try to move this through here.
Sure. Here's a unique version of your CV.
I don't know why
you stand out.
Let me.
Just like the other
Let me go back
that I
to
gave
our,
today. Good luck.
sorry,
Why?
not sure why this isn't, oh, this is not right. Let me get to off of YouTube. I seem to be, my screen is trying to take the night off in its own kind of crises right now. I'm going to stop screen sharing just for a moment and go back to my presentation. Let's try this. Okay. I'm going to screen share again. Sorry about this. Dr. Warner, are you able to grab control of this? For some reason, I can't get out of my PowerPoint. Wait, hold on. Let me try. Here, I got it back to share.
Okay, great.
Okay. You all have, you see this slide coming up? We got it?
Yeah, you're good.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to talk you through, it's easy to see when it's bad, and it can be make you think, well, I would clearly know what to do in this situation. But I want to walk you through a story arc that also happened around the time of the pandemic that I think shows how difficult this is. So right now, I want you to take off your hats of being EMBA students, of having the role in your profession that you have, and I want you to pretend that you are a Gravity Payments communications team, legal team, the folks who are going to be dealing with investor relations, the folks who would have to deal with Gravity Payments. Gravity is a credit card processor. And around 2020, at the same time as the pandemic was happening, you think of how many companies were suddenly facing a huge change, a huge shift, a huge crisis because of what was happening. For Gravity Payments, which was credit card processing, they had a major problem because people weren't going out to eat. They weren't leaving their homes. They weren't buying things by credit cards. And so suddenly they were basically saying their revenue was cut in half and they were going to go bankrupt in a matter of weeks, if not months, if something wasn't done very quickly. The CEO was Dan Price, and he basically went very public with tweets saying, this is our problem. I mean, look at the date on this tweet in 2020. This was March 30th. So this is a couple of weeks after we're all stuck in our homes and wondering what the heck is going on. He had gone to them and had 40 hours of meetings, basically said, how much are you all willing to sacrifice to try to keep this thing running, to try to keep your employees going? And he was handling this on what was then Twitter instead of X, saying, we surveyed our employees, 98% volunteered to take a temporary pay cut to avoid layoffs. He used this as a broader management lesson, saying, before you resort to layoffs, talk to your employees. Maybe they're willing to do something to save your employees' jobs. So this was something that was happening in March of 2020. And guess what? When he did, it looked pretty good for him and for the company. This is the kind of stories that started happening, showing up on Market Watch and the New York Times and Forbes and all of these different places. This is a Washington state company, how they avoided layoffs even when revenue was cut in half. Gravity Payment employees volunteer to take a pay cut. This company pays it a minimum salary. That's helping it weather the coronavirus issue, the crisis. So if you are on the comms team or the legal team of Gravity Payments at this point, you're looking pretty good. This is exactly what you want. This is free press. Things are great. Okay, so where's the crisis? You handled it. Well, not long after that, suddenly the person who was Dan Price, the amazing CEO who was teaching people and helping them learn how to do things, saw this headline: the world's most generous boss faced domestic violence claims. Oh no, that's not the crisis. That's not the headline that you wanted for your company, especially because your company had kind of gotten to be famous because of your CEO. Now, the very person who had pulled you into the spotlight is pulling you into a more negative light. And so think about, how do you react to that crisis? Things did not go as planned. However, had you sold him out and said he's a terrible person, we don't stand by him, look what happened shortly after that. This is now April 19th of 2023. The assault charges had been dropped against the CEO who gained fame for raising his employees' salaries while slashing his own. So we had the hero, then we went down to zero, and now we see, well, wait, where does that take us if the legal process has changed against him? How do we still talk about him with our company? Do we want to be part of this? How do we go? Well, the next headline within a year said he's back at Gravity Payments. He had resigned, but then he's back on what was then. You can see the arc of this. It's no longer Twitter, it's now X. He's back to working full time, the company founded over 20 years ago, in a new role advising and assisting the CEO on strategy. It's been great to be back. I think this is such a great example of shifting narratives, thinking of what comes next, and who would have guessed that those things come next. Usually you see a CEO go, and that's the last they're mentioned. They're scrubbed from the website, they're scrubbed from investor relations, they get their golden parachute, and they are gone. He came back, right? And so think about how difficult this is. This is what's tough about crisis. I think this ad, you're the PR experts. How do we say unmitigated disaster in a way that sounds like no big deal? It's what I heard from, I'm sorry, I didn't have your name when you said it because I couldn't see it, but the idea of what if the word gets out on embezzlement? How do we say no big deal, or we've got it handled, or in any of these issues that we're dealing with? That's the real challenge. And it's happening in so many venues. As I said, last year I was working with legal professionals, compliance professionals, and we were talking about just how do we deal with unmitigated disaster? The communication side, the folks that are like me are saying, we got to get a message out there very quickly. We need to be as transparent as possible so we can say, hey, we're doing what we can to tell you what we know as we know it. We want a consistent message. We want everyone talking about it. Our reputation is at stake, and we've got to get out there and say what we're doing. And we certainly don't want to be that guy from West Virginia and Freedom Industries talking about himself. We've got to show that we're empathetic, that we are a company that cares about our customers. We understand it. We're going to get them through it. Okay, that's what I'm saying. How many of you are legal folks who are saying, wait, hold up there? That's all well and good, but we have to be careful here. We have a lot of potential liabilities that could come into play. We have NDAs, we have confidentiality agreements that we cannot violate, and we have to stick to what our code of ethics is. We have to be flexible because we don't know if we say something bad about this CEO and disavow him. We don't know that he might have charges dropped against him and want to come back. So we've got to give ourselves enough wiggle room that we can do this. And as opposed to being empathetic, which might put our company in a position of advocacy or taking a position that we're not sure that we're wanting to take in this environment, we want to stay pretty neutral with our tone. We want to not go too far into caring about what people are saying because we've got to protect ourselves in the long run. This is one day. We're a 133-year-old company, and we've got to think about the bigger picture. That's a lot of conflicting values, and that doesn't even get into everything else. And so this is what gets tough. This is what we're going to do when we're dealing with our simulation, because you're all going to be coming at it from your own perspectives. But I think there's a good way to think about this arc, and I really liked Penn State University came up with this, and I think it's just really simple. So I like to credit them for it. You're really having to think in the stages of crisis communication of getting beyond just the crisis, just that middle column, which is where we tend to live, because that's where it takes our energy, and then everything goes away and we have to deal with it. So pre-crisis, thinking about what are the risks that are here? How are we looking out for what might be out there? How are we planning for what happens? What's the what if? And are we training these people to get ready? In the crisis, how do we hold it together? How do we keep our values in place? How do we keep our engines running? And then remembering that even when it's over and we take a deep breath of fresh air, we have to remember what's the fallout on this? How's it going to come back to haunt us? How do we need to protect ourselves from happening again? So these are the things that you're going to be thinking about it. Pre-crisis, monitoring the risk is really important. And when I think of that, as Dr. Warner said, I like to be out in nature. I love to do national parks. And this was one that I saw out in Yosemite. And it always has struck me. I took pictures as we went by because it was saying, watch for rocks. And you went a little further down the road and it showed this, image of rocks falling. And I watched that and I thought, is this sign really necessary? Because if the rocks are falling onto my, rented SUV, am I going to have any time to react if it's falling? Or is it just hitting me and I'm going to be a goner and I'll never know about it? And I kind of wondered about what good are these signs? But sometimes I think in crisis communications, we try to just say, well, watch out, bad things might happen. We'll be ready to if they do, but we don't really think about what that means. So when you're thinking about how do you watch for rocks that are falling, how do you get out ahead of that in the pre-crisis, conducting regular risk assessments. What is out there that could be areas that you just never anticipated? Who's going to that matter with that? The risk monitoring, actually saying not just we think it could happen, but who's on the lookout, who's continually trolling and scanning to make that happen. I think this is a place where AI is making crisis communications a bit easier by putting more eyes on the situation, analyzing risk for crisis communications. Does anybody use AI for this in your own roles right now when it talks about being able to go through so much data and so much information to see what's bubbling to the surface that you might not have been able to have the manpower to identify otherwise? Anybody experiencing this helping you yet? It's something that I think can really happen. And as Professor Warner and I were talking before all of you came on, there's also a really good way to use AI to start to say, in the past it was anticipate the problems, right? Anticipate what the other people might be saying about you. You can now start to use AI to say, I am this company. Here's who I am. Here's what I stand for. Here's all this data dump of information. Here's what we're going to be saying. And you got to be careful on this to make sure you're not putting out private information that could then become part of a public conversation. But what are my stakeholders? Explain to me the potential arguments that my stakeholders could have. You can ask AI to do some of the thinking for you to help you prepare for the arguments that are coming. AI also, though, as we know, can make things difficult because it can get disinformation and misinformation moving faster. So it can create some problems. Last year, I was looking at this slide deck that I had done a version of this for your cohort last year. And when I was asking them with AI to put together a review of major corporate crises, I left this in because this is what 2024's AI did. And it was kind of visual. But there's a lot of problems with this, right? Like it was really crowded. There's a lot of errors in spellings. AI just looked pretty rough. It didn't look like something that could really help you if you were saying, how can I quickly put this together? I asked it to do the same job yesterday when I was doing this, and though it's not exactly beautiful because there's too much information on it, I wanted to include this. In a matter of about 3 seconds, it came up with a timeline of the last 25 years of crises. It told me where all the companies were, when it fell into happening, and it took these circles and actually did it by size. You can't quite see it, but there's a little grid down in the bottom talking about the larger the circle meant the greater reputational damage, scrutiny, and communications challenge. It wasn't necessarily the number of dollars that they lost or impact to their shareholders, but look what AI did in literally 3 seconds, how that difference is from that to this. This is showing us the power of AI, also the concerns, because what if you happen to be one of these companies? I got to put my readers on to see this tiny, tiny little font. But what if you are Boeing 737 Max and AI has it wrong? And it wasn't the Boeing 737 Max, it was a Boeing 727 Max, and it was something different, or it can bring up something that you thought was buried that was 10 years in the past. Suddenly there it is to be part of the conversation again. Risk assessment is something that AI it makes easier and more difficult for us. This is important. Establishing clear communication challenges. How are you getting things out? In the past, and there are a number of companies who say, we're going to do a press release. Well, that's great, except you go through a 2-day press release verification, making sure everybody's good with it and has signed off on it. And unfortunately, that has meant 2 days that the message gets out in other ways by other people that can be against what you were wanting. So that communications channel is important. And then the plan and holding statements. You can start to say, we know there's going to be a government shutdown. We are the FAA. So let's start getting some statements ready weeks in advance, knowing this is coming and what we're going to do. We are this trade association. This is how it's going to impact our stakeholders. We're going to get some things ready. We might have to tweak it a little bit when it comes, but we're going to have most of the work done so we can pull it out, dust it off, sharpen it up, and have that ready to go very quickly. That's something that can be really critical on the beginning side. When we do our simulation, you're not going to have time to do any of this except maybe thinking about how you might use AI if once you are assigned to a particular stakeholder group to say, what are the other ones that we've assigned? What might they be thinking? That might be a way to do it. But realistically, we're not going to spend a lot of time focused on that part of it. Besides this, training people who will be involved in the crisis management process. Just last week, that CEO who went to my friend who came to me and said, how quickly can you train us now that we have a problem? That's not something you can do in half an hour. Just as if you wouldn't probably go to a doctor who had a half an hour experience on how to, suture your cut on your head. You're going to want someone who's known how to do this a little bit longer. That training has to happen earlier in the process. And I can tell you how that can pay off. A few years ago, I was teaching anti-terrorism assistance program. It's through this Department of State. It's a lot of hard skills. It's a lot of law enforcers who are going in, talking about interrogations, talking about how to prevent terrorist attacks, people who have skills far beyond what my skill set is. But I would go in talking about how to work with police and media relations, how to work with your stakeholders on this, and train some of the people who were doing it. I was in Brazil and it was a 2-week course. There was another group that was there the week before with one group, and then I was coming in on the second week. And when I came in, they were talking about what had happened just the day before. And this was the story that had happened. 3 Brazil police had been arrested after allegedly dragging a woman behind the car. This woman was in a favela in Brazil and went to buy bread. And police thought that she was stealing something. She was shot in the midst of a conflict by them. They wanted to take her to a hospital, but they couldn't get an ambulance into the favela. And so they literally put her in the back of their trunk and took off. The problem was she was not secure in the trunk and she fell out and was being literally dragged to death as she was going down. And people were trying to stop the police and and the police just kept going. And people had one of these, a phone, and they started recording. And so then there's a picture of this poor woman being drugged to death by the very police who had shot her. How does this have to do anything about training people? There was an officer who had gone through 1 week of training. He was a really green officer. He had never done anything like this before. And he had gone through this because his department had said, you think you should be trained in case you ever need this, just in case. It turned out that he was on the weekend, the young guy on staff, he was the junior person who was the spokesperson for police at the time this happened in the area where it happened. And so suddenly this person who had just graduated from a training course on Friday, the next day or two was up in front of national media having to talk about what the police strategy was, where they had failed, what the investigation was doing. This was something that eventually led to the president of Brazil, then at that time, stepping down. It was a huge story. And the person who was the first person to be the spokesperson in the face of the crisis was someone who had learned how to do this for the first time 7 days earlier. This is how training matters. It's not because you have a master's degree in it and have spent years doing it. That's great if it does, but it's also saying who in your department might need to be prepared in the event this happens. There's a really great article that I read just a couple of months ago, and I wasn't able to find it for you here, but it was actually saying every member of every organization should in some ways consider themselves a spokesperson in a crisis. Not that they're the one going out, but they need to be trained in thinking about how am I going to communicate my slice of it or make sure I'm getting the official message to communicate to my stakeholders in this, my clients, my customers, even my neighborhood. How does this work? And so the fact is, every one of us in some ways becomes a representative of our organization, whether we're out in front of the cameras or just getting paid by this organization when it happens. How are you going to have a voice in that? So that's pre-crisis. Then we'll get to the actual crisis when you're collecting and processing the information. We know the limitations here. In a crisis, saying it exists. This is the only product claim that legal would allow. I come from a journalism background, and so I know that my bias is get as much information out there as possible. I also know from a corporate side, there are times that you simply cannot. Either you are restricted by, limitations from within your company or regulatory guidelines that it might be across an industry. There are just things that you can't do. So I want to talk about how you can do something in a crisis, even when you're really tied in. This is one more example of what happened during a crisis, and it happened back in the beginning of this year, so a lot newer. And it was happening in Los Angeles when the mayor of Los Angeles had been in Ghana. Even though she had said she was not going to travel if elected to her office, she did. She was in Ghana, and that's when the terrible fire broke out in her city. So she came back and she was met at the airport by a Sky News reporter. So it wasn't someone from Los Angeles. It wasn't the LA Times. It wasn't KABC or KTLA, the local news stations. It was someone from another country who stuck a camera in her face when she was getting off a plane. So imagine this, your city's burning. You've just gotten off of a probably 18-hour travel day and you get hit with these questions. So how do you respond? This is what happened.
I was burned over.
And we'll go through the skip here in just 4 seconds.
At Valley Medical Center, ultimately saved my life.
Spend millions of dollars, Madam Mayor. Have you nothing to say today? Have you absolutely nothing to say to the citizens today? Elon Musk says that you're utterly incompetent. Are you considering your position? Madam Mayor, have you absolutely nothing to say to the citizens today who are dealing with this disaster? No apology for them? Do you think you should have been visiting Ghana while this was unfolding back home?
Okay, you get the sense. I would love to know your thoughts if you are watching this. What do you think of that response in a crisis? Anybody have any thoughts on what you would do if you were the mayor or the mayor's chief of staff there?
Making a tough situation worse.
How so? Jeff, it's great.
I mean, just
Yeah.
not responding. So it's almost an admission of guilt or just putting a spotlight on the uncomfortableness. So she should have just some very quick statement to say to move along, and maybe express some level of concern for the situation going on the ground, but not talk about any of the controversy around her situation, right?
Absolutely. Anybody disagree or anybody else have a take on this? And thanks for weighing in.
I just think it makes her look incompetent. And I think that's, by her silence, that's maybe even worse in that position, is just to be perceived as incompetent or uncaring as well.
I see someone else weighing in.
I'm surprised that, well, maybe it did happen, but I would have thought that her staff would have been briefing her on the airplane, just expecting that she was going to get a question somewhere. And even if there was a very brief statement of, look, we're monitoring the situation. I got back on the airplane as quickly as I could. Yeah, I probably shouldn't have been, but I'm back. I responded as quickly as could. My staff is on it.
Absolutely. And does anybody want to think of, can anyone justify what might have been going on? I'm not asking that you agree with it, but can anyone think of what might have been going through the mayor's mind to not say anything?
I think if the interviewer is from maybe a more conservative or what she feels like an adverse network, maybe she's avoiding answering the question because it feels like he's trying to what they call gotcha questions.
I think that's a really good point. That fear of, saying nothing, saying something wrong might have been worse than saying something. I don't think that's exactly how it fell on any of us necessarily, right? And so I think the point is on this that no comment is not the way to go. It doesn't generally make people feel like you do have that competence, that you understand what's going on, especially if you think about what's happening in the city where more than 100,000 people have evacuated, tens of thousands of acres have been burned. There's a lot she could have said even without knowing the details yet. And we're going to go into that in a little bit, but I want you to think about, I might have to stop this share again and go back in. It goes back into this idea of, let me see. Sorry, I'm sorry that this is doing this today. I don't know why. Any other thoughts on this as I'm getting back into doing this correctly?
The thought I was going to add is, it's one of those things where if she was some more junior person and, there's maybe an excuse for the right answer is to just not say anything and some other person come over top later and explain why that person couldn't. But, leadership just implies a responsibility, and like her role to just literally ignore it just I think is at conflict with what being the mayor of a major city in a crisis requires of any kind of comment, something.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. And the people who said, the staff should have prepared, that's that risk assessment, right? On the plane, there was time to think, and who knows, I don't know where this reporter came from. And it was kind of a gotcha situation. But also I think you have every right to ask a mayor, what are you going to do about these people, right? You want a plan, you want some kind of feeling of leadership. So there are 7 must-say words in a crisis. If you are stuck and you don't know what to say, you can say something. Here's what we are going to do. Telling us that there is some kind of an action being taken, even if it's we are assessing what's going on and we're going to get you more information. There's something more that you can say than nothing at all. And in doing so, I want to give you a quick example. Last year in Georgia, there was the Appalachia High School shooting, right? And so we have all become very familiar with the timeline of what a school shooting happens. But I want to just show you how quickly in Georgia they were putting this timeline together with what was happening in a short amount of time. They didn't have a lot of time, the folks who were dealing with the crisis, to get messaging out. But yet at the same time, if you are dealing with a community wondering, parents wondering if their children are dead, people wondering if their teachers are dead, other people wondering, is the shooter on the loose? Are we at risk? A story that went to immediately national headlines. So it's not just your community wondering, but reporters from all across the world. Suddenly your community simulcasting these pictures of your agency. I want to show you what was happening when they were acting quickly. 8:30 in the morning, classes began. Everything was fine at 10:20, active shooter calls. Within 3 minutes, law enforcement was dispatched. Within 25 minutes from the active shooter calls, there was a school message that was going out to parents. That was probably a message that they had ready in a holding statement. In the event of a shooting, what are we going to do? Here's the basis of it. We're going to fill in the blank with what's going on so we can get this thing out there without error quickly. By 11:56, so an hour and 36 minutes later, they had a report that there was a suspect in custody. And at 1:15, they had their first news conference. So the first word went out that there's a suspect, that we don't have to worry about your safety in terms of a larger threat to the community. They shut that down as quickly as possible. They let people know there's not a continued threat. But then within 3 hours total, they had their first news conference where they were talking to people. First victim count, though, wasn't provided until almost an hour after that. So their first news conference is, here's what we know, here's where it happened, here's how long it took us to respond. We have a suspect in custody. Here's the basics of what we know. But they didn't at the time say, we think there could be 23 victims, or we think there could be 6 victims. They didn't give a number because you don't want to be wrong on that until 2:13. So they told some information, but they held off on the next because the last thing you want to do is underestimate or overestimate a victim count. Then the victim was in court, and then the details came later. So as the press conferences started coming, they got more in depth. At the next part would be, here's what's happening with the victim that's going to be in court. Here's the procedure for that. The later details could be what was happening, were school doors propped open? Had there been calls about concerns about this shooter in the past? You can see how there was always information coming out, but it was coming out in different layers of details. And that's a really important skill to be thinking about when you're thinking about your simulation and the tabletop exercise. What can you say and when can you say it? But you never going to say nothing at all. You're not going to be the mayor of Los Angeles getting off that plane. I talk a lot with the law enforcers when I'm working with them on crisis communication, saying there are things you can say right now. Let's say that this vehicle has just crashed into a building and you're having a press conference a few minutes later. You've got everyone at the scene, you know what's going on, and they're asking you questions. There are things you can say besides no comment. You could say, what time did the call come in that there was a building that had been hit by a car? How long did it take you to get on the scene and everyone else? Where did it happen? Who is serving with the agencies? Where is this happening? What do people in the immediate area need to do? Do they need to leave their homes because they could be structurally unsound because there are gas mains that have been, severed and there could be further concerns? Is there an action you need to get out to the community? Was this because the person who crashed in had a medical emergency, or is it because they are a serial killer who's now on the loose, right? Like, what do you need the community to do? All of those things are things that you can very quickly share that shows, here's what we are doing right now, but it doesn't get you into any trouble. It doesn't tell you things that go into speculation, that go beyond the scope of what you can realistically know right now. There are always going to be speak downs.
I was also going to say, Emily, for the shooting scenario, one just an overarching comment. I really hate that we have like a set, best processes for these kinds of cases, right? But second, I think in those cases, it's such a multidimensional issue. Like it's a multidimensional situation where you don't want to say something to the media before the parents of the victims.
Yeah.
So there's definitely that aspect of it as well. But yeah, I think they definitely handle that, at least from a public knowledge perspective, much better than other situations. But I think the other thing that you need to balance with that is that public dissemination versus who should know the information first and who should be aware of what's happened.
It's an excellent example, and thank you for pointing that out. It is. I mean, there is a little bit of a playbook, but because of that, you have to think, what do people, we know the questions that people are going to ask, but does that mean we want to answer them yet, that we even can? Or do we have to respect the fact that we have families who are gathering, waiting to see if their child is injury or a fatality, right? Those are very different things. Even if it's I can tell you in newsrooms, if someone who's inexperienced might say, "Oh, it's only three kids who were killed." It's not only three kids. If that's your community, if that's your kid, if it's anything, if it's your kids who were safe, but now they have to deal the rest of their lives with the fact that they had a classmate who was killed in a school shooting. It's never only, right? And so, thinking of how to say yes, it's not the worst that's ever happened, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have concerns that happen, and that applies as well. I'm using crises like this because I think it's easier to show than business crises, but we know the same thing comes into play if it's a only a 6% stock hit. That might be someone's entire difference between retirement and not retirement, right? So it's how do you gauge and frame what's going on? But then you talk about you can then later on say, we're going to tell you in 6 hours, we're going to have another press conference, or in 3 hours, or 2 days from now. And that's where you start getting into the details. That's when you know how many people here were injured or killed, what did cause it. Have you caught the people responsible? Is it terrorism? You don't want to speculate at the beginning saying, we don't know, this could be terrorism. Yeah, that could be factually correct, but that sets up a whole different scenario than if it was a medical emergency. So is there something else to blame that could be putting me in danger? Has this happened before? Who's to blame? We all go into the who's to blame question very quickly. And those are the things you're not going to talk about until you definitely know more. You can say things like, we're still gathering information about the number of people killed and injured in the attack. We're going to make that available to you when we have accurate numbers. In the case of the baby formula simulation that we did, we don't know how many kids, we don't know how many cans might be out in people's shelves of this tainted baby food formula. So you're not going to say, we're pretty sure that we've got all the cans accounted for if you don't know for sure. You're going to say, we're still gathering the information about the number and the lot numbers that are provided. Here's what we can tell you right now. Here's a website. Here's a phone number that you can call to get more information. Helping people feel that they have an agency in this is really important. We're not going to discuss any possible suspects or motives at this time. This is an ongoing investigation. You talk a lot about with organizations, if you're dealing with HR issues, there are a lot of things that you can't say, but you can say, we're investigating this. As we investigate this, here is our policy. Here's our HR policy. And we're going to be following that policy as we go into this. I don't know if any of you followed, I worked in Iowa. I grew up in Iowa. There was a big story in Iowa headlines over the past couple of weeks when the president, or when the head of the schools, the principal of the largest school district, not the principal, the superintendent of the largest school district in Iowa was uh, arrested by ICE, and questions about, he was from Ghana originally, and questions about his immigration status. Well, that set up a lot of you should have heard the questions that the school board had to answer right away. Does this have to do with the presidential administration's policy on immigration, or is this someone who was violating it? What does this mean for the kids? Is this political? Is this personal? What is this? And they didn't know the answers to those questions, and they couldn't answer it right away. So they had to say, here's our policy, here's what we know, here's how we're going to investigate, and then took it step by step, day by day, as more information became available and being able to talk about it. They took it as they could do it. This is an article that I found really interesting. It's a source called PR Daily, and they were basically talking about the mayor of Los Angeles and that press conference that we saw. And a communications officer said, if I were doing this, the mayor could have said, "Thank you for understanding." And I heard one of you kind of say this. "I just landed. I'm in a meeting with my team. I'm going to have some answers for you tomorrow." At least that, at the very least, would have shown that she's on it as much as possible and she's going to get it. Instead, by staying completely silent, that narrative turned against her. I think she could have gone even a little bit further than this. Here's what we are doing. Here's who we have on the ground. We have this in place. Here's what you can do. And I'm going to get you more information. My team has been doing this. This is their information. Now I'm coming into play. This is especially important during a crisis where people's health, well-being, everything they own is on the line. When something like that is happening, there are some statistics that say you may have to repeat something anywhere from 7 to 20 times for people to get through the crisis that's in their head, all the noise. In some ways, it's like that duck video that I showed you at the beginning. You're watching one thing happening, you're hearing someone else talk, and your brain simply can't take it in because you're thinking, did I get out my kids' baby photos? Am I going to lose my job? Well, where am I gonna afford to put my family tonight? They're thinking all that while you're trying to get some information through to them. So there's so much more that she could have said in this situation. During a crisis, you got to know who's speaking, know your audience, who cares about this. What is your tone? Just even if the mayor had said, our heart goes out to all of those who are fearful right now. We are doing everything we can to keep them safe and to help those who are in the way of this fire. Just that sentence showing that there was an empathy as opposed to standing stonily quiet. Anticipating the critics that no matter what you do, someone's going to think you're wrong. So how do you start to get ahead of that? And then you do say what you can say and stop. Stop. You don't go into the speculation. You say, this is as much as we can know. And as we saw, if you don't tell your story, someone else will. The mayor not talking didn't mean people stopped talking about the mayor's role in the fire. It meant that they started doing it with their own narrative, with what it meant. And the last thing you want to do is give someone else the power of your narrative. So the more that you can do that. Finally, when we go to post-crisis, assessing it afterwards that it happens, this 80% is a number that I also think is really interesting. Deloitte did another survey. So you've got, PwC working at the front end of this. Deloitte was doing another survey saying, how many of your organizations have actually had to activate their crisis management teams in the past 2 years? 80% said they had. So there's a lot of people who are doing this on a regular basis, far more that did than didn't. And they took a look at what are the lessons that you took away from this? What would you do differently than you had? And I think this is so helpful as to informing us how we think about it before and during a crisis. We want more detection and early warning systems. We want to have a better idea of what's the chatter going on ahead of time. We want to invest more money in prevention and more effort in prevention. It does suck to take somebody out of their work for a week and give them a week of media training or a week of crisis communications training. Or we have so many fires to put out that are going on, we can't think about preparing for those that might be starting, but almost 1 in 3 said they wish they had that. And doing more to better identify potential crisis scenarios, monitoring social media, communicating better with the customers, better defining the chain of command. Instead of saying, we've got it, this is who's going to talk. Well, what if they're on vacation? What if they are out for dental surgery that day? Who else is going to do it? Preparing for that and communicating more effectively with the employees. Realizing that you've got to get your message out across the board, but not just externally, internally matters. You also have to do the after action report. In Lahaina, they really had an example of that in Maui. This is that image of the tree that was scarred. It was so famous, but it started to come back to life. This was a post analysis that was going on. There was a lot of criticism that they came under right away. As Lahaina burned, fire an hour for equipment. Those are not the kind of headlines that you want, saying people were burning and you couldn't even get the fire equipment there. Like, how did that happen? These were heroic firefighters. How could you not put the right equipment in their hands? A year after it happened, they did an after action report. The county did. There were actually a number of after actions reports that were done by different departments, by the governor's office, but this is just one slice. And you can look up if you're interested in how can you do an after action report to say, how do we go back and take that look back to make it help us looking forward? This is a pretty good one that they did. And just for an example, looking at how they address that problem of firefighters not being able to get their equipment in place, they said, here's the problem, here's the observation that we had. Turned out there wasn't a standardized equipment inventory. Nobody really knew what people had and where it was. And so they were having to spend an hour delay trying to get the warehouse staff up to equip the vehicles. So what are they doing? Here's 3 things that we are going to do to address that in the future. We're going to try to make sure that there's a standard inventory, that there are secure facilities. We're actually going to check up on this so that we can see in a year, that we actually still have all these vehicles there. This is just one tiny slice of what the whole after action report is, but taking the time to intentionally look at what happened and how you can not only say that went wrong, but here's how we fix it for the future. In these after action reports, you're saying, how did we do? And having the guts to say, we did well on this, we did okay, and here's the parts where we didn't. How was our communication? What are our goals? Update the crisis plan. Don't just say we got through that, put this back in the shelf until we need to pull it out again. You got to update it with what's different and what's new. Take a look at the long-term impact. Remember that a year from now, people are going to come up and want to do the 1-year anniversary story. What went wrong? Remember that there might be lawsuits that are filed. So you've got to be ready to meet the evolving information that comes at. You might have that one person who was the hero who it turned out died and after this many days in the hospital, or the court process that went through, and suddenly when they're convicted, there's a whole other story that reignites this. So really looking at that and making it actionable. Nobody cares that you gave yourself an 8 out of 10 in response. They want to see that you're doing something so if it happens again, it's better. When I taught working that 4-week-long seminar, I brought in a lot of crisis communicators to add a voice, and they talked about the biggest thing is people will let you fail once. They will understand that the bad things happen to good companies, and they may not be totally forgiving, but they will say, listen, you dealt with it and we get it. But if it happens again, then their trust is completely deteriorated. So you've got to make it actionable to show what you're doing, that you're not just hoping that it never happens again. And as we kind of move towards wrapping up, because I would love to hear your thoughts and questions, I also want to remind you that just because a crisis happens doesn't mean that it's all over. There was, at the time this was happening earlier this year, and at the time that 100,000 people more than signed a petition angry about what the mayor had done, angry about the mayor's response, angry about her staying silent in that Sky News interview. 125,000 people signed a petition. And if you are within the mayor's office, which I am not, and I don't know people who are, I haven't heard what would happen, but there had to be some sort of sense of what do we do now? What do we do about this? Is it over? Do we have to put somebody else in place? That was January 12th of 2025. Today is October 8th. And if you go on and look up Karen Bass, you will see her website for mayor running for 2026 election. She declared her candidacy, and you can donate to it on this website. This is a very different view than the person who stood silent less than 10 months ago. And I think this is a great example. I am not endorsing her or against her. This is not a political statement, but it shows that there is a lot of ground that can be covered in 10 months or in 10 days or in 10 hours. And when you're thinking about crisis communications, it's not just getting through what's happening at the moment. It's looking at how this plays out over time. We kind of wrap up. This is the problem with crisis. Crisis meetings always come at a bad time. There is never going to be a good time for a crisis to happen. There's never going to be a good time to prepare for one. There's never going to be a good time to look back on one, because things just keep rolling. But these are important parts that, as you think about this, and may you never, knock on whatever wood is around you, may you never have to have a crisis as bad as what we've been talking about. But chances are you're going to be experiencing this, either dealing with it hands-on or in the tangential ripple effects as it's happening to your organization or something that impacts you. This is the reality. And so I hope that what you take away from these next couple of weeks as we're talking about crisis communications, as you get to play with it, is some empathy for how difficult this is, some ideas on how you can contribute if this is something that falls into your world, and understanding that this is hard work, but so important as we get each other through. Standing out in the storm is what matters. If you're interested in learning more about me or want to send some thoughts my way, this is my LinkedIn QR code. You can go to that and connect with me and tell me how this might be impacting your lives. I would love to learn from your examples. But in the minutes that we have left, I just love to get any thoughts that anyone has, questions for me, or anything we can do to help prepare for when we are all together in person in a couple of weeks, trying this out for ourselves. How many of you does this hit home? How many of you have had to be a part of navigating your organizations through either a big crisis or just a small crisis, but it wasn't any easier? Sebastian, I see your name up, your hand up.
Hey, yeah, sorry. I think a recent example was kind of through the lens of DE&I. Um, that shop falls underneath the umbrella of like the division that I'm part of. And so um, to kind of stay out of the crosshairs of the ire of this current administration, we had to pivot quite a bit in terms of what our external practices looked like, to include media training, to include different types of protocols that we have moving forward. So that's been fun.
Any lessons learned from it?
I think we were in a better place than most. I think that the folks or organizations that weren't kind of building those ecosystems ahead of time, that had just kind of like joined organizations that seemed to be relevant at the time, uh, fared less well. What I mean, I guess said another way, is that there were a number of organizations that withdrew from community partners as soon as this started happening. And they drew the ire of like both sides, right? Because on the one end, you had people who were saying, hey, these folks are practicing, um, biased, uh, bias practices for certain groups, and then you had another group saying, "Well, this is still important," and you try to kind of stay out of either's crosshairs. But if you're in the middle, it usually means that you already had like a kind of a good strategy to begin with, which we kind of found ourselves in. So we've maintained or managed to stay out of that negative light, I think, for a longer period of time than others.
Thanks for your example. I'm going to go to Randall and then Kirk. But one of the things that I love that you said, Sebastian, is building the ecosystems ahead of time, right? That thinking about this might be the world that we're in. And so those organizations who 4 years ago were saying, we're getting involved in Black Lives Matter and making really strong stances, you couldn't just necessarily just completely change your view with a different administration without looking like what do you stand for? What are your values, right? So being able to think ahead of time about how to adapt to operate under current guidelines, which are the necessity, right? You have to operate with what's compliant. I had lunch with someone 2 days ago that was talking about they partner with the government, and so they had to take their mission, which was one thing, and do what they do while being within compliance with the government so that they can continue to get funding. And so it wasn't something that you could just say, I'm not going to do it. You couldn't. And so having to think about how to, as you say, thread that needle to continue the mission while working with the new guidelines is really critical and a different crisis. So thank you for that. Randall, I would love your thoughts.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for your time this evening. And second of all, I would just ask kind of what your guidance would be to kind of the person that is executive adjacent, that kind of understands kind of the landscape and how the narrative's going to evolve, whether or not you engage or not, and what advice you might give to those folks and how to influence their principal, their executive on how to best engage in that kind of public communication space.
That is a really good question and a really tough place to be in, right? Because executive adjacent means you may not have the final influence, but you might have potentially a broader view of it. I think in some ways using these kind of opportunities to start to say let's talk about it ahead of time, let's start to identify our stakeholders as much as you can, draw them in ahead of time. This last year when I did the webinar for the legal departments of all these hundreds of people across the country, hundreds of organizations across the country, one of the reasons that this association made that education important possible was for that exact same reason, so that the legal departments could say, I'm learning this, here's what I have, I want to request time that we start to push this ahead of time. So in some ways it gave that entree to have the conversation. So if in an ideal situation you get to have that way in advance. If it's instead the crisis is happening and you're meant to do it, I think it's just having the courage to say, here's what else I'm hearing. Here's another way to think about it. Maybe it is, the using different, here are different ways of thinking. The worst thing that can happen in a crisis is everyone saying, you're right. The ducks just going across and following randomly. Being able to say, we have to think about this in this way. I think pressure testing, even if it only takes a few minutes, is really, really critical to say, yes, but what if? What will they say? What will our critics say about us? It's not a perfect answer, but imagine if that an executive adjacent staffer who was standing with the mayor in that run airport would have said, even if they had just stepped in and said, here's what we're doing. The mayor just got off, but here's what we know. Here's what's going on. Let me give you that information. They could have even guided that, even in a worst case scenario. So I think it's just having the courage and the bravery to say, we can't just all agree on this. Does that help a little bit?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. It's not easy and it's not fun. Kirk, I've got you and then Jared next.
Yeah, in food and beverage, one of the big crises items to prepare for is recalls. And having gone through one at a prior startup, just understanding the cost of it as I approached my current startup, which is a baby food product, it really made me warrant an intentional investment into our quality program, as well as our recall readiness program, as well as investing ahead of, in terms of crisis PR, professional services team, that typically a startup likely wouldn't have the funds or the willingness to make that investment in that bet. Knowing the dynamics of this category, how important it is to our mission and the brand, those all made sense, but it's one of those things that you never want to have to go through. But being ready, decisive, and transparent is ultimately really important. And if that situation does come up.
Wow, you could teach a master class, right? Like telling your investors when they're wondering where's the money going as you're a startup, that we're going to do in prep, that we're going to invest in preparation, is so admirable. Was it a tough sell to say, we're going to prepare in the event that this happens? Was that a difficult fight?
It wasn't, just given in the category that we play in and how important it is to parents, and to ultimately our consumers, which are the babies and toddlers.
Fantastic. Thank you for that example. And I'm glad we're not doing the baby tabletop exercise, although because you would have a great advantage, but I do wish that I could learn your perspective on that. I think it's fantastic to think about the costs of recall and the importance of preparing ahead. Jared, you have your hand up, and then
Yeah.
Sarah.
There's a little bit of a tempest in a teapot that I dealt with maybe a month ago, but I deal with the exec comp function. We hired a new CEO and he got a huge pay package, and there's a lot of nuance in how you report that. And a local beat reporter in Hillsboro, Oregon, where we're technically headquarters, but we don't really function out of there, picked that up and reached out to ask us about a comment about a story they were going to run, and we declined to respond to it. And then they ran with it and misstated the number and said the CEO made $96 million, which is a billion times more than the average employee. So and then it got picked up. So it got picked up in like the Apple stock feed. It got picked up by Business Insider, and we were really wondering, well, what do we do? Do we correct this? Because it was factually wrong, but then the correction was, well, he didn't get paid 96 million. It was only 72 million. We're like, I mean, is that really better? Like, I mean, and
Yeah.
this local beat reporter won't even understand the nuance or care. Like they're looking for the if it bleeds, it leads kind of story. And then we kind of thought about it again. And we do have an outside advisor that we talked to, and we just kind of realized that the shareholders are going to get the nuance and the complication, and they don't care. It's already out there in the public, anyways. So the real audience we were trying to control for is really our employees. Like they're the ones that probably never read our financial statements, never read our proxy disclosure, all of that. And so probably realize, yeah, a CEO probably gets paid a ton of money, but they never really saw the real number, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so we ended up not running a correction, not getting into locking horns with this literally, local yokel beat reporter, and just tried to like hope it died. And then we had our internal marketing comms put out an internal statement verbally over the next all hands call to address it. But it was, that's one of those things where it kind of goes back to what Ruby was saying is, thinking about who is the right audience, that you're really trying to reach and win and at what time. And, because our initial reaction was, well, we have to correct this. We can't have a falsity out in the public. That's just wrong. And then we're like, well, the correction isn't materially better. It doesn't really improve our position. And then at the end of the day, who are we really solving for? And it's not really the public. They don't really care. The numbers is going to be as big as they want it to be, believe. It's really our employees that need to understand. So that was probably about a month ago.
Wow, that is not a tempest in a teapot. That's a major thing when it's happening and when the headlines are going everywhere and you're doing a Google search and seeing that. Thank you for that story. And I think it's such an excellent example of know what you want to say and then stop. That continuing the back and forth would have only put more content out there that was going to be one small line of difference, that the message, the interpretation wasn't. But you figured out who your audience was that was going to be the most critical, which was internal. I think that's an excellent example and something please all just kind of file that away in your brains about when we're in this, when we're in our simulation. There may be times you want to talk, and there may be times you say, we're going to let this round pass. This isn't us. We're going to spend our time strategizing about what else we should be doing right now. Sarah, I'm going to ask you really quickly, and then we'll wrap up so that I don't keep any of you longer than you're committed for. Sarah, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, first of all, this has been super helpful, and I just kind of appreciate the high level training. I think I'll go into these crises a little more prepared. But hearing Kirk talk kind of made me think of something we deal with in the student housing industry, and that is, death by suicide. We know that we house like probably over 100,000 students every year, and statistically, we're going to be dealing with, sadly, about a dozen suicides every year. And when I first started in this industry, we were caught off guard every time. And it was like it was happening for the first time in that market to that property manager. And, we've evolved. And unfortunately, like this is a crisis that's kind of taking over the 18 to 22-year-olds that are going off to college. But instead of just kind of having a templated response, we've kind of leaned in and partnered with a nonprofit, Hi, How Are You Foundation, and tried to take more of a preventative approach and set the standard for the industry as far as awareness and training and protocol. And it kind of went beyond our company and just ended up all of our competitors joining forces as well. So it wasn't something that ended up ever in a press release, but when you're talking about people's lives, it's just as much of a crisis, even if it's not hitting the news, even though, sometimes it does. But the Hi, How Are You partnership definitely hit the news and kind of took a different spin on the crisis.
Excellent note to end on, right? That there can be from bad, there can be something good that comes out of it, and how you are able to frame a crisis and look at it creatively can lead to some solutions that would have never gotten any. We wish there was no need, but when there is a need, how can you address it and tackle it in a new way? Thank you for that perspective. I think as I wrap up, first of all, thanks to all of you for listening and doing this. I really am looking forward to meeting you in person. It is one of my most fun days that I get to spend all year. And to go back to Randall's question about being executive adjacent, about 2 months ago, I was asked by an executive coach, a very high level executive coach who coaches CEOs, to do some media training. Let's just to look at the CEO's investor relations video that he had done, and just to give some feedback on his presence. And so I did. And then I said, I don't mean to overstep here, but as I was watching this, I was thinking about what's going on in the world right now. And I want them to be aware, if you don't think it's overstepping, I think you as the executive coach should bring up this particular issue that I see happening in the administration could potentially impact them. And they might just want to think about being ready. And she's like, I said, I don't, that's not what you hired me for. And I don't mean to tell you what to do, but I just can't let it go without saying I've got this gut feeling that this might be relevant. She said, okay, I think that's good. I'll think about it. I woke up the next morning and there was an email and she said, look at this story. And literally, the Associated Press had picked up the story that I had anticipated could be a story, and it was in outlets all across the country. And I gained so much credibility. It wasn't my crystal ball. It was just me having the courage to say, I think this might be something to think about that might be coming down. I would have never placed a dollar bet that it would have been a story in the next 6 hours, next 12 hours, but it was. And I think what it comes to having the courage to say, I think we should just look out for it. If I'm wrong, let me be wrong, because we hope that there are no crises in the world. But we find out that these things tend to happen. And it brought me so much credibility with not only the executive coach, but with the CEO, because it helped him prepare for something and get through something that he had never thought he would navigate. I tell you that not because I'm a hero in my own story. Again, I would have never totally anticipated it. But this is all about courage to say there might be bad things that are happening to good people and good companies. We can help make it. And that's what I hope you take away from this, is that empowering you to look at problems in a whole different way. This is how you reach me. I look forward to connecting with as many of you as you would like before we meet in person, and I really look forward to working with you. And Professor Warner, thanks again for bringing me in for another engaging class. I'm so pleased to be a part of it.
Thank you so much, Emily. Looking forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks, and I think this is going to be a fantastic setup for our simulation there.
Okay, have a great night, everyone. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.